Okay, welcome back. In this session I'm going to go through the miscellaneous envelope modulations and the LFO. I discussed modulations in the last session where you can modulate a chosen parameter using attack, decay, sustain and release options. Although this is clearly a handy tool for modulating certain parameters like the pitch and filter cutoff, there may be times where you want the signal to be either modulated periodically or even modulated by another modulation or a signal to create an evolving sound. This is where the LFO and miscellaneous modulations come in respectively. LFO stands for low frequency oscillator and is essentially an oscillator running in the background of the synth as a set speed determined by the user that can be used to modulate given parameters. The most obvious use of this is obviously the dubstep wobble bass line. So let's take a look. So let's start with a fresh initialized patch so it sounds like this. And set the first oscillator to -1 octave for a low tone so it sounds like this. Let's have a listen to the different waveforms, starting with a sine wave by changing it here. The sine wave is the most simple type of waveform with no harmonics, and it sounds like this. As you can hear, because there aren't any harmonics, it's quite deep. The next waveform is the sawtooth, which we heard earlier on, but just as a reminder, it sounds like this. Then, if we listen to the triangle wave, there are only a few odd harmonics in there, so it sounds like this. As you can hear, it has less harmonics than the sawtooth wave, which is a much richer sound with both odd and even harmonics. Then the next waveform is the square wave, which has a lot more harmonics, like the sawtooth, but only the odd ones, so this time it sounds like this. A variant of this waveform is a pulse wave, which is like a square wave but actually asymmetrical in shape, which creates different variations in harmonics, which make it sound like this. Then the next waveform is another variation of the PWM wave, which sounds like this. Then there's a fairly unique waveform next, which actually sounds like this. Finally, on these oscillators, the last available waveform is noise, which is all the frequencies at the same amplitude, and that sounds like this. This waveform is pitchless, as you can hear, so it's useful for creating snare drum or effects sounds, for example. So that's the available waveforms in Sylenth 1, so let's set this oscillator down one more octave to -2, and let's put the waveform back to this unique one before the noise. So it sounds like this. And now if we add in 8 voices to fill it out, and it should sound like this. Now let's head to the LFO module and assign the first drop-down box to alter the pitch of the oscillator AB. Now let's turn the dial next to it all the way in a clockwise direction so that it oscillates in a positive direction, and set the gain of the LFO to have full effect. Now you can hear the pitch of the oscillator is being affected by another oscillator, and it sounds like this. If I turn the rate up a little bit to something like 2/1, and then I hold a note down for a long time to cover the whole period, it sounds like this. You can hear the pitch is moving in a sine wave motion with both an upwards and a downwards movement, so if we change the waveform of the LFO module to a sawtooth one, for example, like this, then we'll get some great sounding ray gun effect sounds like this. Then we can also change the timing of the LFO and make the rate faster at, for example, 1/8. Then it should start to sound like this. And then if we want, we can also change the synchronization so that it's unrelated to the tempo using this free switch here, so it now sounds like this. And if I wanted, I could automate that to speed up in a track, I'll hold down a note now and move the dial so you can hear what it sounds like. Now if we want to make a classic filtered bassline sound, there are just a few short steps to do this from the patch we've just made. Let's start by resetting that free switch back on so it synchronises with the track tempo again, and set the rate to 1/8. And then change the LFO parameter to affect the cutoff AB so it sounds like this. Now you can hear there doesn't seem to be anything modulating at the moment. This is because the type of filter needs to be set here, so let's assign a low pass filter, and now it should sound like this. Now if we change the waveform shape on the LFO module to a sine wave, so that the cutoff modulates up and down smoothly once again, it should sound like this. Notice the offset dial here. This is for setting an offset of amplitude in the LFO, where for example a sine wave starts at 0 amplitude, reaches a level of +1, and then passes 0 on its way to -1. Well, we can offset that using this dial, so that the gain of the LFO starts with 1 and reaches +2 before passing 1 again on its way back to 0. So this is what it sounds like when the offset is in the centre. And this is what it sounds like with the offset all the way in the negative direction. And then this is what it sounds like with the offset all the way in the positive direction. Now let's reset that back to the centre. This offset tool can come in handy when you're needing just a small tweak, especially when you're working with pitch modulation and something sounds a little out of tune. Now to spice it up just a little bit more, let's add some modulation envelope to it, controlling the LFO frequency rate. This means we can use the envelope to set how fast the LFO goes over time, in order to make the filter open and close at different rates. To do this, I just select LFO1 rate in the mod env1 section, and then bring down the dial just a touch to around 40%. And then let's lift the attack to around 40% too, and now it should sound like this. So now we have two modulations going on. You've got the LFO controlling the cutoff, and then the mod envelope controlling how fast the LFO goes. With a slight attack time set, you can hear the LFO rate is essentially being slowed down for the first cycle or two, so it sounds like this. Now let's try and make that even more evolving. To the right of the LFO units, you can see more modulation systems called MISC1 and MISC2. These are probably the most creative modulation units on the synth, as they allow you to choose any given parameter to affect any other given parameter. So let's choose the mod wheel to be the modulation source. And let's choose this to affect the LFO1 rate. Then we'll turn up the dial a small amount to around the 60% mark. And now when we hold a note down and adjust the modulation wheel, we actually adjust the LFO1 rate too, so it sounds like this. So that's the modulation session done. I recommend you play around with all the options in those and get yourself familiar with what each one does. But the options are almost limitless in assigning multiple signals to affect multiple devices, and this is mostly learnt through trial and error. Once you have the basic understanding in place, which hopefully you do now. So thanks again, see you soon.